I never imagined that the worst day of my life would also become the day everything changed forever. My name is Elena, and for 15 years, I believed I was living a fairy tale. I was married to Richard Blackwood, a successful real estate mogul who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Chicago. Our penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan with floor-to-ceiling windows that made me feel like I was floating above the city. Richard was 20 years older than me, distinguished with silver hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. When I met him at a charity gala, I was 25 and working as an art curator at a small gallery. He swept me off my feet with private jet trips to Paris, surprise deliveries of rare orchids, and the way he looked at me like I was the most precious thing he'd ever found. Within 6 months, we were married in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. But fairy tales, as I learned, sometimes have dark secrets hidden between their golden pages. Richard had 2 children from his first marriage, Marcus 32, and Victoria, 29. They were both successful in their own right. Marcus ran the family's investment firm, while Victoria was a prominent lawyer from the beginning. They made it clear that I was an outsider. They called me the replacement when they thought I couldn't hear, and treated me like an expensive accessory their father had purchased. I tried everything to win them over. I remembered their birthdays, asked about their work, invited them for family dinners. Victoria would smile politely and find excuses to leave early. Marcus would answer my questions with single words and spend most dinners on his phone. Richard always dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "They'll come around," he'd say. "They just need time." 15 years. That is how much time I gave them. The signs of Richard's declining health started about 2 years ago. He began forgetting names, getting confused about appointments, having trouble with simple tasks. The doctors called it early onset dementia. I became his constant companion, managing his medications, driving him to doctor visits, making sure he ate properly. Marcus and Victoria barely visited, claiming they were too busy with their careers. I watched the man I loved slowly disappear. Some days he didn't recognize me. Other days he was perfectly lucid, telling me stories about his childhood or sharing his dreams for our future. On his good days, he would hold my hand and say, "Promise me you'll be okay, Elena. Promise me you'll fight for what is yours." I thought he was just being sentimental. I had no idea he was giving me a warning. Richard passed away on a Tuesday in March. The funeral was a grand affair, hundreds of people, flowers everywhere, a service that felt more like a business convention than a goodbye. I sat in the front row, wearing the black Chanel dress Richard had bought me for our anniversary, feeling completely alone despite being surrounded by people. The reading of the will happened 3 days later, in the imposing conference room of Henderson, Brooks and Associates, the law firm that had handled Richard's affairs for decades. I sat across from Marcus and Victoria, who looked like predators, waiting for their prey. Their lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Miss Chen, had flown in from New York specifically for this meeting. Old Mr. Henderson, Richard's longtime attorney, cleared his throat and began reading. The will was exactly what I expected, and exactly what Marcus and Victoria had been planning. Marcus inherited the real estate empire. Victoria got the investment portfolios and business assets. Various charities received substantial donations that would make excellent tax write-offs. And me, I got a token amount, $50,000 and my personal jewelry. That is it. After 15 years of marriage, after caring for Richard through his illness, after giving up my career and my independence to be his wife, I was being dismissed like a temporary employee. Furthermore, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality, the penthouse apartment will transfer immediately to Marcus Blackwood, as the new head of the family estate. I felt the blood drain from my face. Our home, the place where Richard and I had shared breakfast every morning, where we'd danced in the living room to old jazz records, where I'd held his hand as he took his last breath, was being given to someone else. Marcus leaned back in his chair, barely suppressing a smile. "I'll need you moved out by the end of the week," he said, not even looking at me. "The building management will need to update their records." "Surely there is some kind of transition period," I started. "Elena." Victoria's voice was sharp and cold. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You've lived comfortably for 15 years. $50,000 is more than generous for someone who brought nothing to this marriage. Nothing. 15 years of my life was nothing that night. I sat in what had been our bedroom, surrounded by boxes I'd hastily packed. The silence in the penthouse was deafening. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every expensive vase was staying with the apartment. They belonged to Marcus now. I was allowed to take my clothes and the few personal items I'd brought to the marriage, photo albums, some books, a ceramic jewelry box my grandmother had given me. Everything else, the life I'd built, the memories we'd made, the future I thought I had, was disappearing. I found myself standing in Richard's study, running my fingers along the spines of his leather-bound books. This room had always been his sanctuary. He'd spent hours here, reading, making phone calls, managing his empire from the massive mahogany desk that dominated the space. The room smelled like his cologne and old paper, a combination that made my chest tight with grief. As I was taking one last look, something caught my eye. Richard's favorite book, a first edition of The Great Gatsby, was slightly out of place. The spine was pushed back further than the others, as if someone had recently pulled it out and put it back carelessly. Richard was obsessive about his books. He would never have left one misaligned. Curious, I pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. As I opened it, I gasped. The pages had been hollowed out, creating a hidden compartment. Inside was a small brass key attached to a piece of paper with an address written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Storage Unit 247, Secure Vault Facility, 1420 Industrial Boulevard. Below that, in his shaky hand, were the words, "For Elena, the real treasure." My heart was pounding as I stared at the key. Richard had hidden something from everyone, including his children, something he wanted only me to find. The next morning I called a taxi to take me to the storage facility. It was in an industrial area of the city I'd never visited, full of warehouses and trucking companies. Securavault was a nondescript building with rows of numbered units. The manager, an elderly man with kind eyes, checked my identification against the rental agreement. "Unit 247, he said, handing me a second key for the lock. "Your husband paid for 5 years in advance, said his wife would be coming for it someday." My hands trembled as I unlocked the metal door and rolled it up. Inside was a small room filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and a desk with a computer. But what caught my attention immediately was the envelope, propped against the monitor, with Elena written across it in Richard's handwriting. I opened it with shaking fingers. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and my children have shown their true colors. I am so sorry for what you must have endured. I know Marcus and Victoria better than they think I do. I've seen their greed, their impatience, their lack of love for anything but money. I've been preparing for this day for 2 years, ever since my diagnosis. Everything you need is in this room. The computer contains files that will change everything. The password is Elena Heart, all one word. I need you to know that the will they read was not my final will. I created a second will, properly witnessed and legally binding, which I've hidden where they will never think to look. But first, you need to understand what you are truly inheriting. I love you more than life itself. You were the light in my darkness, the joy in my later years. You deserve so much more than what my children tried to give you. Be strong, my darling. You are about to discover just how powerful you really are. All my love. Richard. P.S. Look in the filing cabinet under B for Blackwood Holdings. You'll want to see those documents first." With tears streaming down my face, I sat at the desk and turned on the computer. When it asked for a password, I typed Elena Heart, and the screen came alive with folders and documents. The Blackwood Holdings folder contained financial records that made my head spin. I had known Richard was wealthy, but I had no idea of the true scope of his empire. There were properties I'd never heard of, business partnerships spanning multiple countries, investment accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But more importantly, there were documents showing how Marcus and Victoria had been systematically stealing from their father for years. I found records of forged signatures on contracts, unauthorized transfers of funds, fake invoices for services never rendered. Marcus had been using company money to fund his gambling addiction, racking up debts at casinos in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. Victoria had been billing the family business for personal expenses, shopping trips, vacations, Even cosmetic surgery. They had stolen over $12 million from their father, and he had documented every penny. In the filing cabinet, I found the real bombshell. Hidden behind fake tax returns was a manila envelope containing Richard's actual last will and testament, dated 6 months before his death and properly witnessed by 3 independent parties. This will told a very different story. Marcus and Victoria each received exactly $1, the legal minimum required to prevent them from challenging the will on grounds of being forgotten. Everything else, the entire Blackwood empire, worth an estimated $280 million, was left to me. But there was more. Richard had included a detailed explanation of his children's theft, with instructions that all stolen funds were to be recovered, and that Marcus and Victoria were to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law if they tried to contest his wishes. I sat in that storage unit for 3 hours, reading through document after document, understanding for the first time that my husband had been protecting me even as his mind was failing him. He had known exactly what his children were planning, and he had outmaneuvered them completely. The fake will they had read was a decoy, designed to make them feel secure while he put his real plan into motion. I spent the next week quietly preparing. I met with a new lawyer, one Richard had recommended in his letter, someone who specialized in estate fraud and family disputes. I had all the documents copied and stored in multiple locations. I opened new bank accounts and took out a safety deposit box. Most importantly, I did nothing to tip off Marcus and Victoria. I let them think they had won. The trap was set for the following Monday morning. Marcus had called a meeting at the Blackwood Holdings office to begin the transition of power. He wanted all the senior executives to meet the new leadership team himself, as CEO and Victoria as head of legal affairs. I arrived at the meeting 15 minutes early, carrying a simple manila folder. The conference room was full of people I recognized, executives who had worked with Richard for decades, lawyers, accountants, board members. Marcus stood at the head of the table, practically glowing with triumph. "Before we begin," I said quietly, standing up from my seat, "I have something everyone needs to see." Marcus looked annoyed. "Elena, this really isn't the time. We have important business to." "Yes, we do," I interrupted, opening my folder. "We have very important business to discuss. Starting with this." I placed a copy of the real will on the table in front of him. The color drained from Marcus's face as he read the first page. Victoria leaned over his shoulder, and I watched her expression change from confusion to horror. "This is impossible," Victoria whispered. "We had the will. We read it 3 days ago." "You read a will," I corrected, "but not the real one. Richard knew exactly what kind of people you are. He documented your theft, your lies, your complete lack of respect for him, and he made sure justice would be served." I turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am the sole heir to the Blackwood estate. Marcus and Victoria Blackwood are no longer employees of this company. Security is waiting outside to escort them from the building." The silence in the room was absolute. Then Marcus exploded. "This is fraud," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "She forged this. She has been planning this for years." "Really?" I remained perfectly calm. "Then you won't mind explaining these to the district attorney's office." I placed copies of the financial documents on the table, records of every dollar they had stolen, every forged signature, every fraudulent transaction. $12 million, I said quietly. "That is how much you stole from your father." He knew, Marcus. He knew about the gambling debts. He knew about the fake invoices. He knew everything. Victoria was hyperventilating. "We can contest this. We'll fight it in court." You'll lose," I said simply. "And then you'll go to prison. The evidence is overwhelming, and it is all documented in your father's own hand. He was planning this for 2 years." The head of security stepped into the room. "Ma'am." I nodded. "Please escort Mr. and Miss Blackwood from the building. They are no longer welcome here." As they were led away, Marcus turned back to me one last time. "You won't get away with this," he snarled. "We'll destroy you." I looked him directly in the eye and smiled. "You already tried that. It didn't work." The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. Richard's real will was ironclad, witnessed by 3 independent parties who testified that he had been completely lucid when he signed it. The evidence of Marcus and Victoria's theft was so overwhelming that their own lawyers advised them to plea bargain. Marcus pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud. He received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution. His gambling debts, combined with his legal fees, left him completely bankrupt. Victoria lost her law license and received 2 years in a minimum security facility. The cosmetic surgery she had charged to company accounts made for particularly humiliating headlines in the legal journals. 6 months after Richard's death, I stood in the penthouse that was now legally mine, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. The space felt different now, not like a museum of someone else's life, but like home. I had kept some of Richard's favorite things: his books, a few pieces of furniture that held memories, the jazz records we used to dance to, but I'd also made changes. I'd converted his study into an art studio, returning to the painting I'd abandoned when I got married. I'd filled the space with plants and color and light. The Blackwood Holdings empire was thriving under my leadership. I'd discovered I had a natural talent for business, something Richard had always encouraged but I'd never pursued. I'd also established the Richard Blackwood Foundation, dedicated to supporting young artists and providing care for families dealing with dementia. On quiet evenings, I would sit in the living room where Richard and I had shared so many conversations, and I could almost hear his voice. "Promise me you'll fight for what is yours." I had fought and I had won. But more than that, I had discovered something I never expected to find: myself. For 15 years, I had been Richard's wife, or the stepmother, or the second wife. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I was simply Elena. And Elena, as it turned out, was much stronger than anyone had imagined. The woman who had been thrown out with nothing but a suitcase and $50,000 was gone. In her place stood someone who controlled a business empire worth hundreds of millions, someone who had outmaneuvered 2 seasoned lawyers, someone who had turned their own greed against them. I kept Richard's final letter in my jewelry box, reading it whenever I needed to remember how much I had been loved. But I no longer needed his protection or his guidance. I had learned to protect myself. Sometimes I wondered if Marcus and Victoria, sitting in their prison cells, understood what they had lost. Not just the money or the business, they had lost the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. Richard had built his empire not just to accumulate wealth, but to create a legacy. They had been so focused on taking what they thought they deserved that they had destroyed any chance of earning what they actually needed: respect, love, and a place in their father's true legacy. The irony was perfect. In trying to leave me with nothing, they had given me everything. I had started as someone who depended on others for security, and ended up as someone who created her own power. The timid museum curator who had been swept off her feet by a wealthy older man had evolved into a business leader who made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars. On the anniversary of Richard's death, I visited his grave with a bouquet of the rare orchids he used to surprise me with. As I placed them on his headstone, I whispered, "I kept my promise. I fought for what was mine, but more than that, I became who I was meant to be." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, I could swear I heard his voice carried on the breeze. "I always knew you were stronger than you realized, Elena. I just needed to give you a reason to find out." As I walked back to my car, I thought about the young woman I had been, so eager to please, so afraid of conflict, so willing to make herself small to fit into someone else's vision of her life. She seemed like a stranger to me now. The woman I had become understood that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the push to discover your own strength. Richard's love had protected me during our marriage, but his final plan had forced me to protect myself. And in doing so, I had found something more valuable than money, more powerful than revenge, more lasting than justice. I had found myself. Marcus and Victoria had thought they were taking everything from me. Instead, they had given me the chance to claim everything that was rightfully mine, not just Richard's fortune, but my own potential. That night, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, looking out over the city lights reflecting on Lake Michigan. Tomorrow, I had a board meeting to attend, a foundation event to plan, and a business empire to run. I was no longer the woman who had been thrown out with nothing. I was the woman who had taken that nothing and transformed it into everything. And that transformation had been the real inheritance Richard left me. Not just his money, but the circumstances that forced me to discover who I truly was beneath the scared, dependent person I had been pretending to be for 15 years. Sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all. Sometimes it is simply becoming so much more than your enemies believed possible that their worst efforts become the foundation of your greatest triumph. As I headed back inside, my phone rang. It was Sarah Mitchell, the director of the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, the same gallery where I had worked 15 years ago. Elena. Her voice was warm but professional. I heard about your foundation. We're planning a major exhibition on women artists who overcame adversity. Would you consider being our keynote speaker? I paused for a moment, thinking about the young curator I had been, so passionate about art but so willing to give it all up for love. I'd be honored, Sarah. Wonderful. And Elena, I always wondered what happened to you after you left. I am glad to see you found your way back to the art world, even if it is from a different angle. After I hung up, I walked through my penthouse with new eyes. In the past 6 months, I had unconsciously been creating my own gallery. My paintings were scattered throughout the rooms, bold abstract pieces that reflected my journey from victim to victor. I had been so focused on running Richard's business empire that I hadn't realized I was also building something entirely my own. The next morning brought a different kind of satisfaction. I was in my office at Blackwood Holdings, reviewing quarterly reports, when my assistant buzzed me. Mrs. Blackwood, there is a woman here to see you. She says her name is Janet Morrison, and it is about your stepdaughter. I frowned. I hadn't heard anything about Victoria since her sentencing. Send her in. Janet Morrison was a social worker in her 50s, with tired eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had seen everything. She sat across from my desk and folded her hands. Mrs. Blackwood, I am here about Victoria's daughter, Amy. She is 16, and she has been staying with foster families since Victoria's incarceration. Her father died when she was young, and there are no other relatives willing to take her. My breath caught. I had forgotten about Amy. Victoria had kept her at a distance during family gatherings, and I had rarely seen her. What does this have to do with me? Amy asked me to contact you specifically. She said you were the only person in her family who was ever kind to her. She is aging out of the foster system soon, and... Janet paused. She is a remarkable young woman, Mrs. Blackwood. Straight a student, wants to study art history. She reminds me of someone else I met 15 years ago. The weight of the moment settled on me. Here was a chance to break the cycle, to show that family could be about love and support, rather than greed and manipulation. I'd like to meet her, I said quietly. An hour later, a tall, serious-faced teenager sat in the same chair Janet had occupied. Amy had Victoria's dark hair but none of her calculating coldness. Instead, her eyes held a mixture of hope and wariness that I recognized from my own mirror years ago. I know my mother treated you badly, Amy said, her voice steady despite her age. I know she stole from grandfather, and hurt people, but you were always nice to me at Christmas dinners, even when she told me not to talk to you. I leaned forward, studying this young woman who carried the Blackwood name but none of their corruption. What do you want to study, Amy? Art history, she said, her eyes lighting up for the first time. I want to work in museums, maybe curate exhibitions. I know it is not practical, but it is perfectly practical, I said firmly. And it is noble work. Art preserves humanity's soul. Over the following weeks, I navigated the legal process of becoming Amy's guardian. It wasn't simple. There were background checks, home visits, and court hearings. But something had awakened in me, a maternal instinct I had suppressed during my marriage, when it became clear that Marcus and Victoria would never accept me as family. Amy moved into the penthouse on a crisp October morning, carrying 2 suitcases, and a worn messenger bag filled with art books. I had prepared one of the guest rooms for her, decorating it with prints of famous paintings, and installing proper lighting for studying. This is really mine, she asked. Standing in the doorway, yes, I said. And Amy, your mother's mistakes don't define you, you get to choose who you become. Having Amy in the house changed everything. Suddenly, the vast penthouse felt like a home again. I would wake to the sound of her making breakfast, humming while she studied at the kitchen counter. She brought an energy and purpose that I hadn't realized I was missing. Amy threw herself into her studies with the same determination I had discovered in business. She applied to Northwestern University's art history program, and was accepted with a full scholarship I had quietly arranged through the Blackwood Foundation. But the real transformation happened gradually, as I watched her discover her own strength. Amy organized art viewing parties for her classmates, started a blog about emerging Chicago artists, and volunteered at 3 different museums. She was becoming the woman I should have been at her age, confident, independent, unafraid to pursue her passions. One evening, about 8 months after Amy moved in, we were having dinner when she looked up from her textbook. "Elena," she said. She had never called me anything but my first name, which I preferred. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret not having children with grandfather?" I set down my fork, considering the question. Richard and I had talked about children, but between his age and my focus on caring for him, it had never happened. I had sometimes wondered if things would have been different if I had given him biological grandchildren. "I used to think I did," I said honestly, "but now I realize that you can build a family in many ways. Sometimes the people who choose to love you are more valuable than the ones who are obligated to." Amy smiled, a genuine warmth that transformed her serious face. "I am glad Mom messed up so badly. Otherwise I never would have gotten to know you." It was an odd way to express gratitude, but I understood what she meant. Out of Victoria's destruction had come an unexpected gift, the chance to be the mother I had always wanted to be, to someone who actually wanted my guidance and love. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus and Victoria had spent 15 years trying to exclude me from their family. Now their daughter was living with me by choice, calling me every day from college, including me in every major decision. At Amy's high school graduation, I sat in the audience watching her give the valedictorian speech about the courage to reinvent yourself. She spoke about how the worst moments in life often become the doorways to the best ones. How family is defined by loyalty rather than blood, and how women have the power to transform their circumstances if they're brave enough to try. As she spoke, I realized she wasn't just talking about her own experiences, she was talking about mine too. I had become her role model for resilience, just as Richard had been mine for love. After the ceremony, Amy found me in the crowd and hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for showing me that it is possible to build something beautiful from the worst circumstances." That night, as I watched Amy pack for her summer internship at the Art Institute of Chicago, another opportunity I had arranged, but she had earned through her own merit, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 2 years ago, I had been a quiet, dependent woman whose entire identity revolved around being someone's wife. I had no career, no real friends of my own, no sense of purpose beyond making Richard comfortable. No, I was running a multi-million-dollar corporation, had established a foundation that was making real differences in people's lives, was raising a brilliant young woman, and had rediscovered my own artistic voice. I had gone from having nothing to having everything that truly mattered. The business continued to thrive under my leadership. I had expanded Blackwood Holdings into sustainable development and affordable housing projects that would have made Richard proud. The foundation had awarded its first round of grants to 12 young female artists and had partnered with 5 hospitals to provide art therapy programs for dementia patients. Most importantly, I had proven that a woman could step into a man's world and not just survive, but excel. The business magazines that had initially been skeptical of my ability to run Richard's empire now featured me on their covers. The Widow Who Built an Empire read one headline, "From Victim to Victor, Elena Blackwood's Remarkable Transformation," read another, "But the best validation came from unexpected sources." Last month, I received a letter from Marcus, written from his prison cell. It was brief and grudging, but it was an acknowledgement. "Elena, I saw the article about the foundation in the Wall Street Journal. Dad would have been proud of what you've done with his legacy. I was wrong about you." Marchese didn't respond to his letter, but I kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the people who hurt us most deeply are capable of growth and recognition, even if it comes too late to matter. Victoria never wrote. According to Amy, her mother was still bitter, still convinced that she had been cheated out of her rightful inheritance. Some people, I had learned, are so invested in being victims that they can't recognize their own role in their downfall. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the same person who had been thrown out of this very apartment 2 years ago. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. She had learned that dependence is a choice, that strength can be cultivated, and that the best revenge is living so well that your enemies become irrelevant. I thought about the young Elena who had met Richard at that charity gala 15 years ago, so eager to be rescued and taken care of. She had been looking for someone to complete her life, not understanding that she was already complete on her own. The real gift Richard had given me wasn't his money or his businesses, or even his love, though all of those had been precious. The real gift was putting me in a position where I had no choice but to discover my own power. Tomorrow Amy would start her internship. Next week, I had a meeting with city planners about a new affordable housing development. Next month, the foundation's first exhibition would open, featuring works by the artists we had sponsored. I had a life that was full and meaningful and entirely mine. I had family that I had chosen and that had chosen me in return. I had work that mattered and resources to make a difference. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing disguised in painful packaging. Getting thrown out with nothing had forced me to discover that I already had everything I needed inside myself. I smiled as I turned off the lights after all. Tomorrow was another day in a life that was finally completely undeniably mine.